They inherited a house that had been buried underground for 70 years, and when they finally broke through the sealed entrance, what they found inside was worth more than the entire town's annual budget. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning mist clung to the hills around Millfield like a shroud, wrapping the small town in gray silence. Martha Collins sat at her kitchen table, the yellow formica surface scarred from decades of use, staring at a letter that had arrived 3 days ago. The envelope was thick, official-looking, with a return address from a law firm she'd never heard of in a city she'd never visited. At 73, Martha's hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from a lifetime of hard work that had left its mark on every joint, every finger. Her arthritis made everything harder these days, from opening pill bottles to turning doorknobs. But it wasn't the pain in her joints that made her tremble this morning. It was disbelief. Harold shuffled into the kitchen, his worn slippers making soft sounds against the linoleum floor that hadn't been replaced since 1978. At 76, he moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose back had been broken by 50 years of construction work, rebuilt with steel rods and stubborn determination, then worn down again by time and poverty. "Coffee's ready," Martha said softly, though her eyes never left the letter. Harold poured himself a cup from the ancient percolator that gurgled and wheezed like an old friend with emphysema. The coffee was weak. They'd been stretching the grounds to make them last longer, a habit born from necessity that had become second nature. "Read it again, Harold," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of their ancient refrigerator. The appliance was older than most cars on the road, held together with electrical tape and prayer, but it still kept their food cold, barely. Harold adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, the frames held together with a tiny screw he'd tightened so many times the metal was wearing thin. He cleared his throat and began to read in the measured cadence of a man who'd learned to read slowly and carefully, having left school after 8th grade to help support his family. "Mrs. Martha Collins and Mr. Harold Collins," he began, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent calling out measurements over the noise of construction sites. "We regret to inform you of the passing of your distant relative, Edgar Whitmore. As per his last will and testament, you have been named beneficiaries of his estate, specifically a tract of land located at," he paused, squinting at the address through his bifocals, "15 miles outside Millfield, comprising approximately 47 acres. Martha shook her head slowly, her gray hair catching the weak light filtering through their kitchen window. The window needed new caulking. She could feel the cold draft even from where she sat. Everything in their house needed something. Repair, replacement, or simply a miracle to keep working another day. "Edgar Whitmore," she said, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. "I barely remember him from family reunions when I was a child. Daddy's second cousin or something like that. Kept to himself, never married, never had children. Always sat alone at the picnic table, reading a book while everyone else played horseshoes." Harold turned the page, his thick fingers careful with the legal documents. "Says here he died at 94, been living as a hermit for the last 40 years. Property taxes are current, no liens, no debts. Free and clear, according to this." He looked up at Martha. "It's ours, Martha. Actually ours." They sat in silence, the magnitude of it slowly sinking in. Martha and Harold had spent their entire 52-year marriage scraping by, stretching every dollar until it screamed. Harold's disability check from his construction accident was barely enough to cover their medications, and Martha's small Social Security payment disappeared into utilities and grocery bills that seemed to grow larger every month while their fixed income stayed the same. Their morning ritual included clipping coupons from the Sunday paper. Though they rarely bought a Sunday paper anymore, they waited until Monday and fished the discarded copies from their neighbors' trash cans. They shopped at thrift stores where the clothes smelled like other people's lives, and the furniture came with histories they could only imagine. They hadn't taken a vacation in 15 years, not since Harold's back surgery, and their last real meal at a restaurant had been their 50th wedding anniversary 2 years ago, a splurge that had meant eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner for 2 weeks afterward. "What do you think it's worth?" Martha asked her, voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make the inheritance disappear like morning frost. Harold shrugged, a movement that caused him to wince as his arthritis reminded him of its constant presence. "Lawyer says it's mostly wilderness. No structures, no utilities running to it. Probably not much, but," he reached across the table and squeezed her weathered hand with his own. Both their wedding rings had grown loose over the years, their fingers thinner from the kind of weight loss that comes not from choice but from necessity. Maybe enough to fix the roof. Their roof had been leaking for 3 years, ever since a winter storm had torn loose several shingles they couldn't afford to replace. Every time it rained, Martha placed buckets around the living room, listening to the steady ping, ping, ping of water drops that had become the soundtrack of their declining years. They'd gotten estimates for repairs, but the numbers might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the sense they made on their budget. "Maybe even enough to fix the furnace," Harold added, though his tone suggested he didn't dare hope for such luxury. Their furnace was older than disco music and twice as unreliable. Last winter, they'd heated the house with space heaters that made their electric bills soar while they huddled together under blankets, wearing coats inside their own home. The furnace repairman had been polite but clear. The unit was beyond economical repair, held together by duct tape and divine intervention. "Should we go look at it?" Martha asked, though part of her was afraid of being disappointed. Hope was a dangerous emotion when you'd been disappointed as many times as they had. Harold nodded slowly. "Tomorrow. First thing in the morning." That night, they lay in their sagging bed. The mattress they'd bought in 1983 had given up most of its support years ago and talked quietly about possibilities. Maybe the land had timber they could sell. Maybe it had road frontage that a developer might want. Maybe, just maybe, it was worth enough to ease the constant financial pressure that had defined their retirement years. "What if it's nothing?" Martha whispered in the darkness. "Then it's nothing," Harold replied, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "But what if it's something?" The next morning dawned crisp and clear, autumn painting the surrounding hills in shades of gold and crimson. They ate a breakfast of generic cereal and powdered milk. Real milk had become a luxury they allowed themselves only on Sundays, then climbed into their 1998 Buick for the drive to their inheritance. The car had been old when they'd bought it, used 8 years ago, paying for it with Harold's entire disability check from that month. It burned oil, the transmission slipped, and the radio only picked up AM stations, but it ran. That was more than they could say for many things in their lives. The drive took them through winding country roads that Harold remembered from his childhood, when his father had brought him along on construction jobs throughout the county. They passed abandoned farmhouses, their windows dark and broken, testimony to the slow death of rural America. Family farms that had supported generations were now empty fields, their barns collapsing under the weight of neglect and economic reality. The GPS on Harold's ancient flip phone, they couldn't afford smartphones, led them down a gravel road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Potholes jarred their old car, making Harold wince as his arthritic hands gripped the steering wheel. The suspension creaked and complained with each bump, reminding them that they were driving their transportation to its breaking point. "This doesn't look promising," Martha said as they navigated around a particularly deep hole that would have swallowed their front tire. "Never can tell," Harold replied, though privately he was beginning to worry that their inheritance might be more burden than blessing. If the land was this remote, this inaccessible, what could it possibly be worth? Finally, they reached a rusted mailbox, with numbers so faded they were barely visible. The post leaned at a 45-degree angle, held upright more by habit than structural integrity. Harold turned into what might have once been a driveway, though it was now more suggestion than actual road. The land stretched before them like a green ocean, overgrown with weeds, saplings, and tangled vines that spoke of decades of neglect. What had once been cleared property was now returning to wilderness, with the patient determination of nature reclaiming what had always been hers. They parked at the edge of the overgrowth and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The silence was profound, no traffic, no neighbors, no sounds of civilization. Just the whisper of wind through tall grass and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. "Doesn't look like much," Martha said, disappointment evident in her voice as she surveyed the acres of untamed land. Harold walked a few steps into the field, his boots immediately disappearing into knee-high grass dotted with wildflowers and weeds. The ground was uneven, full of hidden roots and rocks that made walking treacherous for people their age. "Hold on," he called back to Martha. "There's something here." Martha joined him, moving carefully through the undergrowth. Her balance wasn't what it used to be, and a fallout here could be serious at their age. Together, they pushed through the vegetation, following Harold's instinct that had been honed by decades of reading construction sites and understanding land. About 50 yards from the road, they found the remnants of what had once been a substantial structure. Concrete blocks, partially buried and covered with moss, formed the outline of a foundation that spoke of something much larger than a simple house. Rusted metal, pipes protruded from the ground at odd angles, and broken pieces of ceramic and glass caught the morning light. "Looks like there used to be a house here," Harold said, kicking at a chunk of concrete with his steel-toed boot. "Big one, too, from the looks of this foundation." The foundation was enormous, much larger than their own modest home. Whatever had stood here had been built on a grand scale, with thick concrete walls that suggested permanence and solidity. Yet now it was all ruins, slowly being consumed by nature's patient reclamation project. They explored for another hour, finding more evidence of human habitation scattered throughout the overgrowth. Pieces of ceramic tile in colors that spoke of 1950s design. Fragments of glass that might have been windows. The twisted remains of what could have been a fence or decorative ironwork. Everything was old, decades old, weathered by seasons, and slowly being absorbed back into the earth. As they prepared to leave, feeling the weight of disappointment settling over them like a familiar blanket, Martha stumbled over something hard, hidden beneath a tangle of blackberry vines. She would have fallen if Harold hadn't caught her arm, his reflexes still sharp despite his age. "You okay?" he asked, steadying her. "I think so," she replied, looking down at what had caught her foot. "What is that?" Harold began pulling away vines and clearing debris, revealing a concrete structure about 4 feet square. Unlike the scattered ruins they'd been finding, this was clearly intact and purposeful. It was obviously man-made, with clean edges and what appeared to be a seam running around the perimeter. "Looks like some kind of hatch," Martha said, bending beside him despite the protest from her knees. Together, they worked to clear more vegetation from the structure, uncovering metal hardware that had somehow resisted decades of weather and neglect. Harold found what looked like a handle, green with verdigris, but still solid to the touch. The metal was thick, substantial, built to last. "You think it's safe?" Martha asked, remembering horror stories of people falling into old wells or abandoned septic tanks. Harold tested the handle gently, feeling it move slightly under pressure. There was resistance, but it felt mechanical rather than structural, like a lock that hadn't been opened in years rather than metal that had rusted solid. "Feels solid enough. Give me a hand with this." They both gripped the handle and pulled. Nothing happened at first, the mechanism protesting decades of disuse. Then Harold repositioned himself, planted his feet more firmly despite his back pain, and pulled with all the strength his aged body could muster. Suddenly, with a sound like a giant exhale, the hatch shifted slightly. A musty smell escaped from the crack, not the stench of decay or sewage they might have expected, but something else. Old air, certainly, but underneath that was something that spoke of preservation rather than neglect. "There's definitely something down there," Harold said, his excitement growing despite his natural caution. "Help me get this open." It took 20 minutes of careful pulling and prying. with frequent rest breaks for Harold's back and Martha's arthritis. But finally, the hatch swung open on hinges that, while stiff, were still functional. The sound it made was like opening a door that had been sealed for decades, which, as they would soon discover, was exactly what they were doing. Below them, a set of concrete steps descended into darkness, disappearing beyond the reach of daylight. The steps were solid, well constructed, with a metal handrail that was still firmly attached to the wall. Everything about the construction spoke of quality and permanence, as if whoever had built this had intended it to last for generations. Martha peered into the opening, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Should we call someone? The police? Maybe. What if there's… She couldn't finish the thought, but Harold understood. At their age, they'd heard enough stories about people finding things they wished they hadn't. Harold was already pulling out his phone, using its flashlight feature to illuminate the stairway below. Let's just take a quick look. Might be nothing more than an old root cellar. But even as he said it, he knew this was something more substantial than a root cellar. The construction was too sophisticated, the engineering too complex for something as simple as food storage. He descended first, testing each step carefully. The concrete was solid, dry, and in remarkable condition for its apparent age. As he reached the bottom, his phone's flashlight beam swept across what appeared to be a hallway with walls lined in some kind of paneling. "Martha," he called up, his voice echoing in the underground space. "You need to see this." She made her way down carefully, gripping the metal handrail that was cool and smooth to the touch. When she reached the bottom, and Harold's light illuminated their surroundings, she gasped. They were standing in what appeared to be a perfectly preserved underground house. The hallway stretched ahead of them, lined with wood paneling that gleamed as if it had been polished yesterday. Light fixtures hung from the ceiling, actual electrical fixtures that suggested this place had been wired for power. The floor was covered in linoleum that looked brand new, its pattern a cheerful geometric design in colors that screamed 1950s. "This can't be real," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible in the strange underground world they'd discovered. Harold moved his light along the walls, revealing framed pictures, decorative molding, even a thermostat mounted on the wall. Everything was clean, dust-free, as if someone had just finished maintaining the place. "Look at this," he said, playing the light across a wall-mounted phone, complete with a rotary dial. "It's like stepping back in time." They moved down the hallway slowly, their footsteps echoing in the preserved silence. The air was cool but not unpleasant, with none of the mustiness they might have expected from an underground space that had been sealed for decades. The first door they encountered opened into what was clearly a kitchen, and Martha nearly fainted at what she saw. The room was complete with appliances that looked like they belonged in a museum exhibit about mid-century American life. A refrigerator with rounded corners and chrome handles. A stove with the kind of clean lines that modern designers tried to recreate. Countertops in cheerful yellow formica, completely unmarked by wear or age. Harold opened the refrigerator, half expecting it to be filled with food that had rotted decades ago. Instead, it was empty, but humming softly, still operational after all these years. "There's power," he said, amazement in his voice. "How is there still power?" Martha ran her hand along one of the countertops, marveling at its perfect condition. The surface was spotless, as if it had been cleaned yesterday. Cabinet doors opened smoothly on hinges that showed no sign of age or wear. Inside, she found dishes, glasses, and cooking utensils, all neatly arranged and in perfect condition. "Harold," she said softly, "this place, it's like it's been waiting for us." The next room was a living area that took their breath away. The furniture was straight out of a 1950s lifestyle magazine, a sofa and chairs in atomic age design, their upholstery still bright and unmarked. A coffee table held magazines with dates from 1953, their pages yellowed but readable. A television set with a tiny screen sat in one corner, surrounded by books and records that spoke of an era when entertainment was simpler but somehow more elegant. Someone built a whole house underground. Harold said, his voice filled with wonder. But why? They found the answer in the next room they explored. It was clearly an office or study, with filing cabinets, a desk, and walls covered with maps, charts, and newspaper clippings. Harold's flashlight beam fell on a framed newspaper with a headline that made them both freeze. Hydrogen bomb tested in Pacific, 1953. Martha read aloud from the date beneath the headline. Harold, this was built during the Cold War. It's a bomb shelter. The realization hit them like a physical blow. They weren't just standing in an underground house, they were standing in someone's desperate attempt to survive nuclear war. The perfect preservation, the sealed environment, the careful attention to detail, it all made sense now. The desk held a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting in fountain pen ink that had somehow remained clear and legible despite the decades. Harold opened it carefully, treating it like the historical document it clearly was. March 15, 1953, he read aloud. Construction of the shelter is complete. The concrete walls are 3 feet thick, reinforced with steel. The air filtration system is functioning perfectly. The backup generators can provide power for 2 years if necessary. If the worst happens, this place could sustain a family for years. Edgar built this, Martha said, understanding flooding over her. Edgar Whitmore built this whole underground house as a fallout shelter. Harold continued reading, his voice growing more amazed with each entry. The journal detailed not just the construction, but Edgar's growing obsession with protecting what he valued most from the threat of nuclear war. Page after page described preparations, stockpiling food, installing backup power systems, creating water storage, and most intriguingly, moving his collection to safety. Collection? Martha asked. What collection? Harold flipped through more pages, finding entries that made his hands tremble. Listen to this. Moved the last of the artworks today. The Picasso sketch is now secured in Vault Room 3, alongside the Monet study. The coin collection is sealed in Vault Room 1. The precious metals are stored in Vault Room 2. If civilization falls, perhaps future generations will discover these treasures and remember what beauty once existed in the world. They stared at each other in the dim light of Harold's phone. Artworks? Martha whispered. Picasso's, Monet. Harold's hands were shaking now as he continued reading. The entries spanned several years, detailing Edgar's systematic transfer of what appeared to be an enormous collection of valuable items into his underground fortress. Paintings, sculptures, rare books, precious metals, gemstones, antiques, the list seemed endless. Look at this, Harold said, finding an entry from 1956. The final entry. Edgar's final entry. Martha leaned in as Harold read aloud. The shelter is complete. Everything of value has been secured. The air filtration system can operate for decades. The power systems are redundant. If I die before the world ends, perhaps my distant relatives will find this place and make better use of these treasures than I ever could. The combinations to all vaults are hidden behind the family photograph in the main room. They rushed back to the living area, where Harold's flashlight quickly found a large framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It showed a family reunion with dozens of people gathered around picnic tables under oak trees. Harold recognized some of the faces' relatives from his childhood, including Edgar as a much younger man, standing slightly apart from the others, with that same solitary expression Martha remembered from her childhood. The frame lifted easily from its mounting, revealing a small envelope taped to the back. Inside were 6 numbers written in Edgar's careful handwriting, along with a hand-drawn map of the underground house, showing rooms they hadn't yet discovered. Vault rooms, Martha said, her voice shaking as she studied the map. Harold, there are 6 more rooms down here. 3 of them are marked as vaults. Harold looked at the numbers, then at the map, then back at his wife of 52 years. They had come here expecting nothing more than worthless land. Instead, they had discovered something that belonged in a movie or a novel, a perfectly preserved underground house from the 1950s, complete with mysterious vault rooms that might contain treasures beyond their imagination. But even as excitement began to build in his chest, Harold felt a chill of apprehension. If Edgar really had hidden valuable items in this underground fortress, they were now the legal owners of whatever lay behind those vault doors. And that kind of responsibility, that kind of potential wealth came with dangers they couldn't even begin to imagine. "What do we do now?" Martha asked, echoing his own thoughts. Harold looked around at the plued, perfectly preserved rooms, at Edgar's journal still open in his hands, at the map that promised even more discoveries ahead. They had inherited more than land. They had inherited a mystery, a responsibility, and possibly a fortune that could change their lives forever. "We explore," he said finally, "but carefully, and we don't tell anyone about this until we know what we're dealing with." As they prepared to venture deeper into Edgar's underground world, neither of them realized that their discovery would soon attract attention from people who would stop at nothing to claim what they had found. The elderly couple who had worried about fixing their roof was about to become the guardians of secrets worth more than they could imagine, and those secrets came with dangers they never could have anticipated. The next morning, Martha and Harold returned to the buried house before sunrise, their old Buick crunching over the gravel road in the pre-dawn darkness. They had barely slept, their minds racing with questions and possibilities that seemed too fantastic to be real. Harold brought a heavy-duty flashlight he'd bought with their grocery money and a camera that still used actual film. They couldn't afford anything digital. Martha carried a spiral notebook to document whatever they might find, her careful, cursive handwriting a skill learned in a one-room schoolhouse 70 years ago. In the gray light filtering down through the open hatch, Edgar's underground house seemed even more remarkable than it had the day before. The preservation was extraordinary. After 70 years sealed away from the world, the place looked like it had been abandoned yesterday rather than decades ago. Every surface gleamed, every detail remained pristine, as if time itself had stopped the moment Edgar had sealed the entrance above. Harold photographed everything methodically, while Martha took careful notes, trying to create an inventory that made sense of what they were seeing. Her arthritis made writing painful, but she persevered, documenting each room with the thoroughness of someone who had spent her life keeping meticulous household records on a tight budget. "Look at the attention to detail," Martha said, running her finger along the edge of a built-in bookshelf. "Every joint is perfect, every corner is square. Edgar didn't just throw this together, he planned every inch." Harold nodded, examining the electrical work visible where panels had been left open for maintenance access. "This wiring is better than what they put in most houses today. He used the best materials, spared no expense. This place was built to last centuries, not just decades." They made their way to the first vault room, following Edgar's hand-drawn map through corridors they hadn't explored the day before. The underground house was larger than they had initially realized, with additional living spaces, storage areas, and utility rooms that spoke of someone who had planned to live down here for extended periods if necessary. The first vault door stood at the end of a corridor, lined with what appeared to be additional storage closets. Unlike the other doors in the house, this one was made of heavy steel with a combination lock that looked like it belonged on a bank safe. Harold's fingers trembled as he spun the dial, following the numbers from Edgar's envelope: 30, 7, 15, 22. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire underground house. Harold pulled the door open slowly, and Martha peered over his shoulder into the darkness beyond. The beam of his flashlight revealed a room lined with shelves, and on those shelves were wooden crates, metal boxes, and cloth-wrapped bundles. Everything was labeled with tags written in Edgar's careful handwriting, each tag noting contents, purchase date, and estimated value. Harold lifted the first tag he encountered: Roman coins, circa 3rd century AD, purchased from Galloway Estate. Auction, 1949. Original appraisal, $8,500. $8,000 in 1949, Martha whispered, doing quick mental math. Harold, what would that be worth today? They moved deeper into the vault, Harold's flashlight revealing tag after tag describing treasures that belonged in museums. Chinese porcelain, Ming Dynasty. purchased 1951, appraised at $12,000. Silver ingots, 99% pure, purchased 1947, valued at $15,000. Gemstone collection, certified by Hartwell Jewelers, 1953, appraised at $25,000. Each item was not just valuable, but historically significant. Edgar hadn't been collecting random expensive objects. He had been systematically acquiring pieces of human civilization, preserving them for future generations in his underground fortress. Martha opened one of the wooden crates with shaking hands. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam padding, were ancient Roman coins in pristine condition. Each coin was individually wrapped and labeled, with detailed provenance documentation that traced their history back through centuries. These weren't just collector's items, they were pieces of history that belonged in the world's greatest museums. "Harold," she said softly, holding up a gold coin that caught the flashlight beam and seemed to glow with inner fire. "This is real. This is all real." The second wooden crate contained jewelry that made Martha's breath catch in her throat. Necklaces with emeralds the size of grapes, rings with diamonds that seemed to capture and multiply the flashlight beam, bracelets worked in gold, so pure it seemed to glow. Each piece was accompanied by certification papers from prestigious jewelers, appraisal documents, and in some cases, photographs showing the pieces being worn by society figures from the 1940s and 50s. Harold found Edgar's purchase records for the jewelry collection filed in a metal box marked Acquisition Documentation. The pages told a story of systematic collecting over nearly a decade, with Edgar purchasing pieces from estate sales, private collectors, and high-end auction houses. The total he had paid, even in 1940s and 50s dollars, was staggering. "Look at this receipt," Harold said, his voice barely audible. A diamond necklace purchased from the estate of a railroad baron. Edgar paid $45,000 for it in 1951. The appraisal says it was worth at least double that even then. Martha was examining a tiara that seemed to belong in a fairy tale. Hundreds of small diamonds surrounded a central emerald that was larger than her thumbnail. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each element was perfectly balanced, creating a piece that was both elegant and spectacular. Edgar wasn't just wealthy, she said, understanding beginning to dawn. He was incredibly wealthy. This is the kind of collection that takes generations to build, not just a few years of buying. The third metal box contained the answer to their questions. Inside were documents that revealed Edgar's true background, not the hermit they had imagined, but the heir to one of the largest fortunes in American history. His father had been a steel magnate who had made billions in the early 20th century, diversifying into railroads, oil, and banking before most people even understood what diversification meant. Edgar inherited over $50 million in 1946. Harold read from a legal document. "In 1946 dollars, Martha. Do you know what that would be worth today?" Martha's hands were shaking as she held photographs of Edgar as a young man, standing beside luxury cars and palatial homes, surrounded by servants and symbols of wealth beyond imagination. But in every photograph, even surrounded by opulence, Edgar looked uncomfortable, as if the wealth was a burden rather than a blessing. "He gave it all up," she said, reading from Edgar's personal journal entries they found in the same box. "Listen to this. The world is growing more dangerous every day. Nuclear weapons make all wealth meaningless if civilization itself can be destroyed in minutes. I must preserve what matters most, not for myself, but for whoever comes after." The second vault room was even more remarkable than the first. When Harold spun the combination lock and pulled open the heavy door, they found themselves looking into what could only be described as a private art gallery. The walls were lined with climate-controlled cases, and inside those cases were paintings that made Martha's knees weak. "Oh my God!" she whispered, moving closer to the first display case. "Harold, is that what I think it is?" Even in the dim light of Harold's flashlight, there was no mistaking the bold brushstrokes and revolutionary style. The painting was small, perhaps 12 inches by 16, but it radiated the kind of creative energy that had changed art history forever. In the bottom right corner, in bold black letters, was a signature that made Harold's hands tremble. P. Picasso. "It can't be real," he breathed, but Edgar's documentation suggested otherwise. The painting was described as Study for les Demoiselles d'Avignon, acquired from private collector, 1952, authenticated by Professor Williams, Harvard Art Department. They moved through the gallery vault like pilgrims in a cathedral. Each new discovery more breathtaking than the last. A Monet water lily study that seemed to shimmer with captured light. A Degas pastel of ballet dancers, so delicate it looked like it might float away. A Van Gogh sketch of sunflowers that vibrated with the artist's passionate energy. And in the far corner, protected by its own specially designed case with additional climate controls, was a larger canvas that made Harold sink into the single chair Edgar had placed in the center of the room. It was a portrait of a woman in Renaissance dress, painted with the kind of technical mastery that spoke of absolute genius. The woman's eyes seemed to follow them as they moved, her slight smile suggesting secrets that had been preserved for centuries. Martha leaned in to read the placard. Portrait study. Attributed to Leonardo da Vinci, circa 1500, purchased from private European collection. 1947. Authentication pending final scholarly review. A Leonardo. Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. Martha, we're looking at a Leonardo da Vinci. But it was Edgar's personal notes about the painting that truly took their breath away. Hidden behind the display case were pages of research Edgar had conducted, correspondence with art historians, and documentation that suggested the painting was not just attributed to Leonardo, it was definitively by the master himself, a previously unknown work that had been lost for centuries. Edgar spent 5 years authenticating this, Martha read from his notes. He had it examined by experts in 3 different countries. They all confirmed it. This is a genuine Leonardo da Vinci, worth. She paused, hardly believing what she was reading. Worth at least $60 million, possibly more. The rest of the vault contained works by artists whose names read like a who's who of art history. Renoir, Matisse, Cézanne, Manet paintings that belonged in the Louvre or the Metropolitan Museum of Art were hanging in a hidden underground room, unseen by human eyes for 70 years. Harold found Edgar's acquisition journals for the art collection, and the story they told was remarkable. Edgar hadn't been simply buying expensive paintings, he had been rescuing artworks from the chaos of post-war Europe, purchasing pieces from families who needed money to rebuild their lives, and in some cases, keeping paintings from being destroyed by political upheaval. Look at this entry, Harold said, reading from a journal dated 1948. Purchased 3 paintings from the widow of a French resistance fighter. She needed money to feed her children. But she wept when I took the paintings away. I promised her they would be preserved and protected, that someday they would be seen and appreciated again. I hope I can keep that promise. The third vault was perhaps the most impressive yet. When they opened the steel door, they found themselves looking at what could only be described as a treasure room from a pirate story. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and on those shelves were containers holding precious metals that glowed even in the flashlight beam. Gold bars stacked like bricks, each one stamped with purity marks and weight measurements, silver ingots arranged in neat rows, platinum pieces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it wasn't just the raw metals that took their breath away, it was the crafted objects that surrounded them. Ancient Greek coins in perfect condition. Medieval goblets worked in gold and encrusted with gems. Religious artifacts that belonged in cathedrals. Jewelry from civilizations that had fallen thousands of years ago. Each piece was documented with the same meticulous care Edgar had applied to everything else, with provenance papers tracing their history across continents and centuries. Martha found herself holding a golden mask that Edgar's notes identified as being from ancient Peru, acquired from a private collector who had inherited it from his grandfather, an archaeologist who had worked in South America in the 1800s. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, with details so fine they could only have been created by master artisans working with tools that modern jewelers would envy. "This single piece is probably worth more than our house," she said, carefully replacing the mask in its custom-fitted case. Harold was examining Edgar's financial records for the precious metals collection, and the numbers made him dizzy. Martha, according to these documents, Edgar spent over $2 million just on gold bars. In 1940s and 50s money, the collection he assembled is worth. He paused, hardly believing his own calculations. "I can't even do the math. This is generational wealth." But perhaps the most remarkable discovery in the third vault was a collection of rare books and manuscripts that belonged in the world's greatest libraries. First editions of works by Shakespeare, Darwin, and Newton, handwritten manuscripts by Mozart, Beethoven, and Bach, historical documents that provided first-hand accounts of events that had shaped human civilization. One manuscript in particular made Martha weep. It was a handwritten letter from Abraham Lincoln, dated just weeks before his assassination, discussing his hopes for healing the nation after the Civil War. Edgar's notes indicated he had purchased it from a private collector who had inherited it from a White House staff member. "This belongs to the American people," Martha said, holding the letter with trembling hands. "This should be in the Smithsonian, not hidden away underground." As they worked through the afternoon, documenting and photographing Edgar's incredible collection, Martha and Harold began to understand the true scope of their inheritance. Based on Edgar's own documentation, and he had been meticulous about appraisals and valuations, they were looking at a collection that had been worth over $5 million when it was assembled in the 1940s, 50s. Adjusted for inflation and the dramatic increase in art and antique values over the decades, they were sitting in the middle of a collection worth well over $200 million, possibly much more, depending on final authentication and market conditions. "We need help," Harold said finally, his voice hoarse from hours of reading Edgar's documentation aloud. "This is beyond us. We need experts, appraisers, maybe lawyers who specialize in estates this large." Martha nodded, but she was terrified. "Harold, what if the government tries to claim it? What if there are taxes we can't afford? What if someone says Edgar didn't have the right to collect these things?" They were interrupted by the sound of Harold's cell phone ringing, a miracle, since they rarely got reception out in the remote area where Edgar had built his underground fortress. Harold answered cautiously. "Mr. Collins, this is Agent Morrison with the FBI. We need to talk to you about a discovery you've made. We're parked outside the entrance to the property. May we come down?" Harold's blood ran cold. How had the FBI found out about their discovery so quickly? They had told no one, spoken to no one except each other. "How did you know we were here?" Harold asked. "The power company reported unusual electrical activity at this location yesterday and today," Agent Morrison explained. "When we investigated the property records, we discovered it belonged to Edgar Whitmore, who has been on our radar for decades. Not for anything criminal," he added quickly, "but Mr. Whitmore was involved in some very high-profile art acquisitions over the years." Martha grabbed Harold's arm. "Are we in trouble?" she whispered. "No, ma'am." Agent Morrison's voice came through the phone speaker. "But you may have discovered something that has been lost for a very long time. We'd like to help you handle this properly." 20 minutes later, Agent Morrison and 2 other federal agents were standing in Edgar's underground art gallery, their professional-grade flashlights illuminating the priceless collection with the kind of bright, steady light it deserved. Agent Morrison was a tall man in his 40s, with the kind of calm demeanor that suggested he had seen remarkable things before. "Mr. and Mrs. Collins," he said after examining several of the paintings, "you've made one of the most significant art discoveries in American history. As far as our records indicate, everything you've shown us was legally purchased by Edgar Whitmore between 1946 and 1958. Harold could hardly believe what he was hearing. "So we can keep it? There will be processes to follow," Agent Morrison explained carefully. "Authentication procedures, tax considerations, insurance requirements. But yes, this appears to be your legal inheritance." And Edgar Whitmore appears to have been a collector, not a criminal. He gestured toward the Leonardo portrait, which seemed to glow under the federal agent's bright lights. "Some of these pieces were reported stolen after World War II, but our research suggests those reports were filed by people who had no legal right to the artworks in the first place. Edgar appears to have been purchasing pieces that were being sold by their rightful owners, often Holocaust survivors and war refugees, who needed money to start new lives." Agent Morrison shared what federal investigators had learned about Edgar over the decades. He had been a World War II veteran who had served in the European theater, witnessing the widespread destruction of art and cultural artifacts. When he returned home and inherited his father's vast fortune, he had made it his mission to preserve important works of art and historical artifacts that might otherwise be lost. "Edgar Whitmore was actually a hero," Agent Morrison said. "He saved these artworks from destruction and preserved them for future generations. The fact that he chose to hide them underground suggests he was genuinely concerned about global catastrophe, but his intentions were preservation, not theft." As the federal agents continued their preliminary examination of the collection, Harold and Martha sat in Edgar's perfectly preserved living room. Overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had inherited, they had come to the property expecting to find worthless land. Instead, they had become the guardians of one of the most valuable private art collections in the world. "What happens now?" Martha asked Agent Morrison as the examination concluded. "Now," he said, "you need to make some very important decisions about how you want to handle this inheritance. There are collectors who would pay you hundreds of millions for this collection. There are museums who would love to display these works. There are tax implications and insurance considerations that will require expert help." He handed Harold a business card. "Call me tomorrow. We'll help you navigate this process safely and legally. And Mr. and Mrs. Collins, don't tell anyone else about this discovery until everything is properly documented and secured. There are people who would do terrible things to get their hands on what you've found." That night, Martha and Harold sat at their kitchen table once again. But this time they weren't looking at an inheritance letter. They were staring at photographs of artworks worth more money than the gross domestic product of small countries, all legally theirs, all hidden beneath the ground they now owned. "What do we do with it all?" Martha asked, her voice small in the darkness of their modest kitchen. Harold reached across the table and took her weathered hand in his. "I don't know yet. But for the first time in our lives, we don't have to worry about the roof leaking." As they prepared for bed, neither of them realized that word of their discovery was already beginning to spread through underground networks of collectors, criminals, and treasure hunters. The elderly couple who had inherited worthless land had become the unwitting guardians of treasures that powerful people would kill for. Their quiet retirement was about to become a battle for their lives, their rights, and Edgar's incredible legacy. The phone started ringing at 6 in the morning, 3 days after Agent Morrison's visit. Harold stumbled out of bed, his arthritic joints protesting the early hour, and grabbed the receiver before the shrill sound could wake Martha. Their ancient rotary phone sat on the kitchen counter, a relic from the 1970s that they'd never replaced because it still worked, and they couldn't afford the monthly fees for modern phone service. "Hello?" Harold croaked, his voice heavy with sleep and confusion. "Mr. Collins? This is Janet Rodriguez from the Associated Press. I understand you and your wife have made quite a remarkable discovery on your property. Would you be willing to comment on the underground art collection you found?" Harold's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He hung up immediately, his hands shaking as he stared at the phone. How had a reporter found out about Edgar's collection? Agent Morrison had specifically warned them to keep the discovery secret until everything was properly documented and secured. The phone rang again before he could even step away from it. "Harold Collins?" The voice was different this time, younger, more aggressive. "This is Marcus Webb from Antiquities Monthly magazine. We'd love to do a feature story on your underground museum. Our readers would be fascinated by the scope of the collection." Harold hung up again, this time more forcefully. The receiver clattered against the base, and he immediately unplugged the entire unit from the wall. Martha appeared in the kitchen doorway, her gray hair disheveled from sleep, wearing the faded pink bathrobe she'd owned for 15 years. "What's happening, Harold? Why is the phone ringing so early?" "I don't know," Harold said, his voice tight with worry. But somehow people know about Edgar's house. They discovered how when Harold went outside to retrieve their morning newspaper. Their story was splashed across the front page of every paper from Millfield to the state capitol. Elderly couple discovers priceless art collection in underground Cold War bunker. The article was shockingly detailed and accurate, describing their inheritance of Edgar's property, their discovery of the hidden entrance, and extensive information about the valuable artworks they'd found inside. What made Harold's stomach clench with fear was that the article included their full names, their home address, and even their phone number. How did they get all this information? Martha asked, reading over his shoulder as her hands trembled. "We haven't talked to anyone except Agent Morrison." Harold was beginning to feel physically sick. The article contained details that only someone with access to federal investigation files could have known. Someone with high-level security clearance had leaked their story to the press, and Harold suspected it hadn't been an accident. "We need to call Agent Morrison right now," he said. They drove to the payphone outside Thompson's Gas and Feed rather than risk using their home line, which Harold assumed was now being monitored by reporters. The morning was crisp and clear, but Harold felt like storm clouds were gathering around their previously quiet lives. Agent Morrison answered on the first ring, his voice tense. "Mr. Collins, I've been expecting your call. Have you seen the morning papers? How did this get out?" Harold demanded. "You said to keep it quiet." Morrison's voice was grim with what sounded like barely controlled anger. "Someone within our department leaked information to the press. We're conducting an internal investigation, but the damage is done. I'm sorry, this is exactly what we wanted to avoid. What do we do now?" Harold asked, watching Martha pace nervously beside the payphone. "First, don't go home yet," Morrison said urgently. "There are already 3 news vans parked outside your house, and reporters are going through your garbage looking for additional information. Second, meet me at the underground facility in 1 hour. We need to secure the site immediately before treasure hunters start showing up." When they arrived at Edgar's property, Harold couldn't believe what he saw. The narrow gravel road that had been empty just days before was now lined with vehicles, news vans with satellite dishes, cars with out-of-state plates, even a few motorcycles. People wandered through the overgrown field like it was a public park, some carrying metal detectors, others with shovels and camping equipment. Agent Morrison was waiting with a full federal response team, 6 agents, 2 security contractors, and a mobile command unit that looked like something from a military operation. "We're going to seal this site completely," he told Harold and Martha grimly. "Until we can sort out this mess, absolutely no one goes down there without federal authorization." As the agents worked to clear the property and install serious security measures, motion sensors, surveillance cameras, and round-the-clock guards, Morrison pulled Harold and Martha aside for a conversation that made their blood run cold. "There's something else you need to know," he said, checking his notes with the kind of careful attention that suggested bad news was coming. "Since the story broke this morning, we've received inquiries from 3 different criminal organizations. Art theft is a billion-dollar international business, and collections like Edgar's are prime targets for professional thieves." Martha gripped Harold's arm so tightly her knuckles went white. "Are we in danger?" Morrison's expression was deadly serious. "Potentially, yes. We're going to provide you with 24-hour protection, and we're expediting all authentication and documentation procedures. The sooner this collection is legally secured and properly insured, the safer you'll be. Over the following week, their quiet retirement life was completely destroyed. Federal agents took up residence in their modest living room, sleeping in shifts on their old couch and monitoring their phone calls. Appraisers flew in from auction houses in New York, London, and Hong Kong to examine Edgar's collection. Art historians from Harvard, Yale, and Oxford requested emergency access to study pieces they'd only seen in grainy photographs. The authentication process revealed treasures even more valuable than their initial estimates. The Leonardo portrait was confirmed as a genuine masterpiece worth at least $60 million. The Monet water lily study was valued at $12 million. The Van Gogh sketch carried an estimate of $8 million. But these individual pieces were just the beginning. Edgar's complete collection was appraised at over $200 million, making it one of the most valuable private art collections in American history. But with the authentication came danger that escalated with each passing day. The first incident happened on a Tuesday night when Harold woke to the sound of breaking glass in their kitchen. 3 men in dark clothing had broken through their back door, demanding to know where the real treasure maps were hidden. They seemed to believe that Edgar had left additional clues to even more valuable caches hidden around the property. The federal agents stationed outside their house responded within seconds, tackling 2 of the intruders before they could escape. The third man disappeared into the darkness, but not before shouting threats about what would happen if Harold and Martha didn't cooperate with people who had legitimate claims to Edgar's collection. "This is getting completely out of hand," Martha said the next morning, sweeping up broken glass while her hands shook uncontrollably. "Maybe we should just donate everything to a museum and be done with it. We don't need this kind of trouble at our age." Harold understood. Her fear, he felt it too. But something deep inside him rebelled against the idea of giving up Edgar's legacy to avoid confrontation. "Edgar left this collection to us for a reason," he said firmly. "He could have donated it to museums himself if that's what he wanted. He chose to preserve it until the right people came along." The break-in was followed by a campaign of intimidation that seemed designed to wear down their resistance. Anonymous phone calls at all hours of the day and night, with voices demanding they hand over what doesn't belong to them. Letters arrived daily, some offering to buy the collection for ridiculously small amounts, others making threats that became increasingly specific and frightening. One letter particularly shook them. "We know where you shop for groceries. We know what medications you take. We know what time your granddaughter gets out of school." The last line was the most chilling because they didn't have a granddaughter, meaning whoever was threatening them didn't even know basic facts about their lives, but felt confident enough to make threats anyway. The federal protection helped them feel safer, but it also transformed their home into something resembling a prison. They couldn't go to the grocery store without a security escort. They couldn't sit on their front porch without agents watching from unmarked cars. Their neighbors began avoiding them, either from fear or resentment about the disruption in their quiet neighborhood. Then the legal challenges began in earnest. The first lawsuit was filed by a man named Richard Whitmore, who claimed to be Edgar's closest living relative and argued that the inheritance should have gone to him as the rightful heir. His lawyer presented genealogy charts suggesting that Harold and Martha were only distant cousins, while Richard was supposedly a direct descendant of Edgar's uncle. The second lawsuit came from Pemberton Auction House in New York, claiming that Edgar had purchased several major pieces through fraudulent means in the 1950s. They demanded the return of a Monet painting and 2 Picasso drawings, plus monetary damages for lost commission opportunities over decades. The third lawsuit was perhaps the most frightening. The Italian government filed a claim asserting that the Leonardo portrait had been stolen from a museum in Florence during World War II. They demanded its immediate return, along with criminal prosecution of anyone who had knowingly possessed stolen artwork. Each of these lawsuits could tie up the entire collection in court for years. Their lawyer, a kind but overwhelmed public defender named Sarah Chen, explained during a meeting at the courthouse. Even if you eventually win every case, the legal fees could easily reach millions of dollars. And frankly, fighting the Italian government is beyond our resources. Harold felt the weight of the world settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. What had started as an incredible blessing was rapidly becoming a nightmare that threatened to consume their remaining years and leave them bankrupt. The stress was taking a physical toll. Martha had developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away, and Harold's arthritis pain had intensified to the point where he could barely get out of bed some mornings. "Maybe Martha's right," he said quietly. "Maybe we should just give it all away and try to get our lives back." But salvation came from the most unexpected source possible. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the distinguished director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, personally flew to their small town and requested a private meeting. She was an elegant woman in her 60s, with silver hair and the kind of refined bearing that spoke of decades spent among the world's greatest cultural treasures. She sat with them in their modest kitchen, surrounded by federal agents and stacks of legal documents, and spoke to them like they were longtime friends rather than strangers who had stumbled into international headlines. "Mr. and Mrs. Collins," she said, her voice warm and genuine, "I have a proposition that might solve many of your current problems while honoring Edgar's original intentions." Dr. Hartwell explained her idea with the clarity of someone who had spent years navigating complex cultural and legal issues. Instead of selling the collection piecemeal or fighting endless legal battles, Harold and Martha could establish a private charitable foundation. The artworks would be loaned to major museums around the world for exhibition and study, generating both substantial income and significant tax benefits. Edgar clearly wanted these treasures to be preserved and eventually shared with the public, Dr. Hartwell explained. This approach would honor his wishes while protecting you from most of the legal and security risks you're currently facing. The foundation would own the collection, but you would control how it's managed and displayed. The financial benefits were staggering. The loan fees from museums eager to display Edgar's masterpieces would generate more than enough annual income to support Harold and Martha comfortably for the rest of their lives. The tax advantages of charitable donations would eliminate their exposure to the crushing inheritance taxes that could have forced them to sell pieces just to pay the government. Most importantly, the foundation structure would provide legal protection against most of the current lawsuits. Museums rarely fought over the ownership of pieces on loan, and the academic prestige associated with scholarly exhibition would make it much harder for criminals to target the collection. "This sounds almost too good to be true," Harold said cautiously. "What's the catch?" Dr. Hartwell smiled. "The catch is responsibility. You would become the permanent stewards of one of the world's most important private art collections. You'd work with museum directors, art historians, and conservation experts. You'd make decisions about exhibitions, research, and preservation that would affect how these masterpieces are seen and studied for generations." She paused, looking around. Their modest kitchen with its worn linoleum and outdated appliances. You'd also have the resources to live very comfortably. The foundation would provide you with a substantial annual stipend from the loan fees and donations. You'd never have to worry about money again. That night, Martha and Harold sat at their kitchen table, surrounded by the chaos that their discovery had brought into their previously quiet lives. Outside, federal agents maintained their vigilant patrol. Inside, their phone continued ringing with calls from reporters, lawyers, and people who wanted pieces of their newfound fortune. "What do you think Edgar would want us to do?" Martha asked, holding one of the many legal documents they needed to review and sign. Harold reread Edgar's final journal entry, the words he had practically memorized during their weeks of stress and uncertainty. These works of art, these pieces of history, they were meant to be shared, not hidden away. "If anyone finds this collection, after my death, I hope they will be wiser than I was, and find the courage to let the world see what I spent my life protecting." "I think he'd want people to see them," Harold said finally. "He spent 70 years keeping them hidden because he was afraid of what might happen if the world ended. Maybe it's time for us to stop being afraid and start trusting that the world deserves to see beauty." The next morning, they called Dr. Hartwell and Agent Morrison to inform them of their decision. They would establish the Edgar Whitmore Foundation for art preservation and public education. They would loan the masterpieces to museums around the world. They would ensure that Edgar's collection would be seen, studied, and appreciated by millions of people who would otherwise never have the chance to experience such treasures. But before they could move forward with their plans, they faced one final challenge that would test not just their resolve, but the character of their entire community. The trouble started when word spread through Millfield that Harold and Martha had decided to establish a foundation rather than simply sell the collection for maximum profit. Suddenly, people who had been supportive became critical, arguing that the elderly couple was giving away money that belonged to the community. A group calling itself the Millfield Citizens Committee began holding meetings at the community center, demanding that Harold and Martha reconsider their decision. The committee's leader, a local businessman named Dale Morrison, who had always resented the federal presence in their small town, argued that the collection should be sold immediately, with the proceeds somehow shared among local residents. "They found that treasure on land in our community," Morrison declared at a packed town hall meeting that Harold and Martha attended reluctantly. "Every person in Millfield should benefit from this discovery, not just two people who happen to inherit the right piece of property." The meeting grew heated quickly, with neighbors who had known Harold and Martha for decades suddenly questioning their right to make decisions about their own inheritance. Some people demanded that the couple sell specific pieces to fund local projects, a new fire truck, road improvements, upgrades to the community center. "You're being selfish," shouted Mrs. Henderson, who had lived next door to them for 20 years. "My grandson needs money for college, and here you are giving millions to fancy museums in New York. What about your own community?" Harold stood up slowly, his arthritis making the movement painful, and walked to the front of the room. The crowd quieted as they saw the hurt in his eyes. 30 years ago," he said, his voice steady despite his emotional pain, "when my back was broken in that construction accident and we couldn't pay our medical bills, how many of you offered to help? When Martha had pneumonia and we couldn't afford the prescription medications, how many of you contributed money for her treatment?" The room grew uncomfortable. Several people looked at their feet. "We've lived in this community our whole lives," Harold continued. "We've been good neighbors, paid our taxes, helped when we could. But when we needed help, most of you looked the other way. Now that we have something valuable, suddenly everyone wants to be our best friend." Martha joined him at the front of the room, her voice clear and strong despite her 73 years. "Edgar Whitmore spent his life protecting those artworks because he believed they belonged to all humanity, not just to whoever happened to own them at any given moment. We're not giving them away, we're sharing them with the world, exactly as Edgar would have wanted." But the most powerful moment came when an unexpected ally stood up in the back of the room. Tommy Rodriguez was 19 years old, a high school graduate who had been working at the gas station since graduation because his family couldn't afford to send him to college. He was shy, soft-spoken, and had never spoken at a public meeting in his life. "Mr. and Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice shaking with nervousness, "I just wanted to say thank you." The room turned to look at him, surprised. Tommy rarely spoke up about anything. "Last month, when my mom was in the hospital, and we couldn't afford the copay for her surgery, you paid for it. You didn't tell anyone. You didn't ask for recognition. You just handed my dad an envelope with $2,000 and said it was from an anonymous donor." Harold and Martha looked surprised. They hadn't realized that Tommy had figured out where the money had come from. "You've been helping people in this town quietly for years," Tommy continued, his confidence growing. "Mrs. Peterson's groceries when her husband was out of work. The Williams family's electric bill when they were about to get shut off. My little sister's school supplies every September. He looked around the room at the faces of people who had known Harold and Martha their entire lives. These are good people. They don't owe us anything. If they want to share their inheritance with museums so that kids like me can see real Picassos and learn about art and history, then we should be proud of them, not angry. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Mrs. Chen, the librarian, stood up. "Tommy's right," she said firmly. "Harold and Martha have been the heart of this community for 50 years. They deserve our support, not our criticism." One by one, other community members began standing and speaking up. The veterinarian, who remembered how Harold had helped build the new animal shelter with his own hands, working despite his injured back. The teacher who recalled Martha, volunteering in the school library every week for 15 years. The volunteer fire chief, who talked about the dozens of times Harold had responded to emergency calls, using his construction skills to help neighbors in crisis. By the end of the meeting, the opposition to Harold and Martha's foundation had crumbled. Dale Morrison and his supporters found themselves increasingly isolated as the community rallied around the couple who had been quiet pillars of strength for decades. But the most touching moment came the next morning, when Harold and Martha woke to find their front yard full of neighbors holding signs. "We support the Whitmore Foundation. Art belongs to everyone. Thank you, Harold and Martha." Tommy Rodriguez stepped forward as a spokesperson for the group. "We wanted you to know that most of us understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. Edgar's collection is going to make our little town famous for something beautiful instead of something tragic. Kids from all over the world are going to learn about art and history because of your decision." Martha began crying not from sadness, but from relief and gratitude. For weeks, they had felt isolated and under attack. Now they realized that their real community, the people who truly knew them, had been supporting them all along. What happens next will turn their quiet act of generosity into a legacy that transforms not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others who believe that beauty and knowledge should be shared rather than hoarded. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The federal investigation into who had leaked their story to the press eventually revealed that a junior FBI analyst had sold information to reporters in exchange for money to pay gambling debts. The revelation led to criminal charges and highlighted the vulnerability that Harold and Martha had faced from the moment their discovery became public knowledge. But by then, the Edgar Whitmore Foundation was already taking shape, with Dr. Hartwell serving as the chief curator and a board of directors that included some of the most respected names in the art world. The first exhibition was scheduled to open at the Metropolitan Museum of Art within 6 months, featuring 25 pieces from Edgar's collection under the title Hidden Treasures, Art Saved from the Shadows. More importantly, Harold and Martha had learned something about courage and community that they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. They had discovered that standing up for what was right sometimes meant standing alone, but that eventually the people who mattered would stand with you. The threats continued for several more weeks, but they gradually diminished as the collection became publicly known and legally secured. It's much harder to steal artworks that are catalogued, photographed, and monitored by international authorities than it is to target mysterious hidden treasures. The legal challenges were resolved one by one. Richard Whitmore's genealogy claims were proven false. He wasn't related to Edgar at all, but was a con artist who had been attempting similar inheritance frauds in several states. Pemberton Auction House withdrew their lawsuit when their own records proved that Edgar's purchases had been completely legitimate. Most surprisingly, the Italian government dropped their claims when art historians proved that the Leonardo portrait had never been in any Italian museum. It had been in private hands for centuries before Edgar purchased it from a family fleeing Nazi persecution. By winter, Harold and Martha's lives had settled into a new normal. They still lived in their modest home, though they had finally been able to fix the roof, replace the furnace, and update the electrical system. The federal protection was reduced to periodic check-ins, and their phones stopped ringing with threatening calls. but the most significant change was in how they saw themselves and their place in the world. They were no longer just two elderly people struggling to make ends meet on fixed incomes. They had become the stewards of a cultural legacy that would educate and inspire people for generations to come. As Harold stood in their backyard one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, he thought about Edgar's underground house and the priceless treasures they had discovered there. But more importantly, he thought about the courage it had taken to share those treasures with the world, despite the dangers and challenges that decision had brought into their lives. They had started their journey afraid of not having enough money to fix their roof. They were ending it as guardians of one of the world's great art collections, with the knowledge that their decision to preserve and share Edgar's legacy would touch lives for centuries to come. 6 months after the final lawsuit was dismissed, Harold Collins stood in what had once been the abandoned Millfield Elementary School, watching construction workers carefully install climate-controlled display cases that would soon house some of the world's most precious artworks. The old school building, which had been empty since the district consolidated 15 years earlier, was being transformed into something the small town had never dared to dream of: a world-class museum and cultural center. Martha walked through the construction zone beside him, her steps more confident than they had been in years. The stress and fear that had marked the early months of their discovery had been replaced by a sense of purpose that seemed to energize her despite her 74 years. She carried a clipboard thick with architectural plans, donor lists, and exhibition schedules that would have overwhelmed her a year ago, but now felt like a natural extension of her lifelong habit of careful organization. "The Leonardo will go here," she said, pointing to a specially designed alcove where workers were installing additional security measures. "Dr. Hartwell says the lighting system alone cost more than most people's houses. But it's necessary to protect the painting while allowing visitors to see it properly." Harold nodded, still amazed by how much their lives had changed. The Edgar Whitmore Foundation had officially launched 3 months earlier with an opening exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art that had drawn visitors from around the world. The success had been beyond anything they could have imagined, but more importantly, it had validated their decision to share Edgar's collection rather than sell it for personal gain. The foundation's success had generated substantial income through loan fees, donations from art enthusiasts, and corporate sponsorships from companies eager to be associated with one of the most remarkable art discoveries in recent history. But rather than simply banking the money for their own comfort, Harold and Martha had made a decision that surprised even their closest advisors. They were bringing Edgar's legacy home to Millfield. The idea had started during a conversation with Tommy Rodriguez, the young man who had defended them at the contentious town meeting months earlier. He had been accepted to the state university on a partial scholarship, but was struggling to find money for books, housing, and other expenses his family couldn't afford. "I'm thinking about taking a gap year," Tommy had told them during a chance encounter at the grocery store. "Work another year, save up some money, try again next fall." That night, Martha had been unable to sleep. She kept thinking about Edgar's journal entries, particularly his repeated emphasis on preserving culture and knowledge for future generations. What good was it to loan priceless artworks to museums in distant cities if the young people in their own community couldn't afford to get an education that would help them appreciate and understand what they were seeing? "Harold," she had said, shaking him gently awake, "what if we established scholarships, not just for Tommy, but for any young person in the county who wants to study art, history, museum studies, or education?" The idea had grown from there. If they were going to honor Edgar's legacy, why not do it comprehensively? Why not create something that would transform their entire community, rather than just benefiting a few individuals? Within weeks, their modest proposal had expanded into something much more ambitious. They would establish not just scholarship funds, but an entire cultural campus in Millfield. The old elementary school would become a museum, featuring rotating exhibitions from Edgar's collection. The abandoned high school would be converted into an arts education center, offering classes, workshops, and degree programs in partnership with the State University. The defunct downtown movie theater would be restored as a performance space for concerts, lectures, and community events. But the centerpiece of their vision was something even more revolutionary. They would create a program that brought inner-city students from around the region to Millfield for intensive summer camps focused on art appreciation, historical research, and cultural preservation. Young people who had never seen a real museum, never touched an artifact older than their grandparents, would have the opportunity to work with original masterpieces and learn from world-renowned experts. You're talking about spending millions of dollars on a town of 3,000 people, their financial advisor had warned. The foundation income is substantial, but it's not unlimited. Harold had looked at the man across the conference table, a well-meaning professional who understood numbers but perhaps didn't understand purpose. Edgar spent his entire fortune preserving these artworks because he believed they belonged to all humanity, Harold had said quietly. We're not spending the foundation's money. We're investing it in the reason Edgar created his collection in the first place. Now, watching workers carefully install the sophisticated security and climate control systems that would protect Edgar's treasures while making them accessible to visitors from around the world, Harold felt the weight of that investment in ways both profound and practical. The Edgar Whitmore Cultural Campus had already begun changing Millfield in ways that went far beyond economics, though the economic impact was certainly significant. The construction projects had employed more than 50 local workers for nearly a year. The ongoing operation of the museum and education center would create 30 permanent jobs, from security guards to exhibition specialists to administrative staff. But more importantly, the project had given the community a sense of pride and purpose that had been missing for decades. Young people who had been planning to leave town after high school were now talking about careers in museum studies and art conservation. Local business owners were investing in their storefronts, anticipating the tourists and students who would soon be visiting regularly. Even the local newspaper, which had been down to a single weekly edition, had hired a full-time reporter to cover arts and culture events. Martha found herself thinking often about the ripple effects of their decision. Every choice they made seemed to create opportunities and changes they had never anticipated. When they had decided to hire locally whenever possible, they had given jobs to people who had been unemployed or underemployed for years. When they had insisted on using local suppliers and contractors, they had injected hundreds of thousands of dollars directly into the community economy. But perhaps the most meaningful changes were the personal ones. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly widow who had been struggling to pay her utility bills, had been hired as a museum docent, giving her both income and a renewed sense of purpose. Dale Morrison, the businessman who had initially opposed their foundation plans, had become one of their strongest supporters after his daughter received one of the first Edgar Whitmore scholarships to study art history. Even their relationship with their own extended family had been transformed. Martha's sister, who had been critical of their decision to give away their inheritance, had visited during the museum's preview week and wept while standing in front of the Leonardo portrait. "I had no idea," she had whispered to Martha. "I thought you were just being impractical, but this is something that will last forever." The opening ceremony for the Edgar Whitmore Cultural Campus was scheduled for a crisp Saturday morning in October, exactly 1 year after Harold and Martha had first stumbled over the hidden entrance to Edgar's underground house. The morning dawned clear and beautiful, with autumn colors painting the surrounding hills in shades that seemed to echo the warm tones of Edgar's most precious paintings. By 9 o'clock, the small town was bustling with more activity than it had seen in decades. Visitors had come from across the region and beyond, art enthusiasts who had read about the collection in national magazines, educators interested in the innovative programs being offered, and families who wanted to be part of something historic and meaningful. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell had flown in from New York specifically for the opening, bringing with her a delegation of museum directors and art historians who were eager to see how Edgar's collection would be presented in its new setting. The mayor of the state capital had come, along with representatives from the governor's office and several members of the state legislature who were interested in the educational initiatives being launched. But the people who mattered most to Harold and Martha were their neighbors and friends from Millfield, people who had known them for decades, who had watched their journey from struggling retirees to international art stewards, and who had supported them through the challenges and controversies that had marked their remarkable year. Harold stood at the podium that had been set up in front of the museum entrance, looking out at a crowd that filled the entire block and spilled onto the surrounding streets. At 77, he had never spoken to a group larger than a church congregation, but he felt calm and confident as he prepared to share the story of their journey. "A year ago," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the portable sound system, "Martha and I inherited what we thought was worthless land from a distant relative we barely remembered. We drove out to take a look at our inheritance, hoping it might be worth enough to fix our leaking roof." Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. Many of the locals knew about the roof that had leaked for years, the buckets that had been a permanent fixture in their living room. What we found was something we never could have imagined, a perfectly preserved underground house filled with artistic treasures that belonged in the world's greatest museums. But more than that, we found a responsibility that has changed our lives and, we hope, the life of our community. He gestured toward Martha, who stood beside him, wearing the new dress she had bought, specifically for this occasion, the first new dress she had purchased in more than 5 years. "We learned that inheritance isn't just about what you receive. It's about what you choose to do with what you've been given." Martha stepped forward to speak, her voice steady and clear, despite the magnitude of the moment. Edgar Whitmore spent 70 years protecting these artworks because he believed they were too important to risk losing. But we realized that hiding beauty away doesn't preserve it, sharing it does. Today, we're not just opening a museum. We're fulfilling Edgar's dream of making sure these treasures will educate and inspire people for generations to come. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was conducted by Tommy Rodriguez, now a sophomore at the State University studying art history with a full scholarship from the Edgar Whitmore Foundation. As he cut the ribbon with ceremonial scissors borrowed from the mayor's office, he spoke briefly about what the museum and cultural campus meant to young people like himself. "A year ago, I was pumping gas and thinking my biggest goal in life was maybe getting promoted to assistant manager," he said. "Today, I'm studying Renaissance art and planning to become a museum curator." That change happened because 2 people decided to share their good fortune instead of keeping it to themselves. The first visitors through the museum doors were local elementary school students who had been studying art history in preparation for the opening. Harold and Martha watched with tears in their eyes as children who had never seen an original painting in their lives stood in wonder before masterpieces that museums around the world had competed to display. 8-year-old Sarah Chen, the daughter of their lawyer, stopped in front of a small Monet landscape and stared at it for several minutes before turning to her teacher. "It looks different than it does in books," she said, "like it's alive." That comment, overheard by a reporter from the state newspaper, became the headline for the feature story about the museum's opening. Bringing art to life in small-town America. But the most meaningful moment of the day came in the afternoon, when the crowds had thinned and Harold and Martha found themselves alone in the gallery that housed Edgar's most precious pieces. They stood together in front of the Leonardo portrait, the painting that had started as Edgar's secret and had become the centerpiece of their public legacy. "Do you think he would be proud of what we've done?" Martha asked, studying the Renaissance master's work that now hung in a small town where most residents had never seen an original painting before this year. Harold considered the question seriously. Over the past months, he had read every page of Edgar's journals, every document in his files, every piece of correspondence he had saved. He felt like he knew the man who had created the underground sanctuary they had discovered. "I think he'd be amazed," Harold said finally. He spent his whole life being afraid of war, afraid of loss, afraid of letting people see what he valued most. We took his fears and turned them into hope. As the sun set on opening day, Harold and Martha walked through their transformed community, greeting visitors who had come from hundreds of miles away to see the museum that was already being featured in national art publications. Hotel rooms were booked solid for the first time in the town's history. The 3 restaurants that had remained open despite decades of declining business had waiting lists for tables. The antique shops and gift stores that had barely survived on local traffic were suddenly bustling with customers eager to take home souvenirs from their visit to the Hidden Treasure Museum. But beyond the economic impact, there was something more important happening. Children who had grown up believing that culture and education were things that happened in distant cities were discovering that beauty and knowledge could exist anywhere people were willing to create and preserve them. Teachers who had struggled for years to make history and art relevant to students with limited exposure to the wider world suddenly had authentic masterpieces to use as teaching tools. Most importantly, the community itself was beginning to see itself differently. For decades, Millfield had been a place people left rather than a destination people sought out. Young people graduated from high school and moved to cities. Businesses closed rather than expanded. The general attitude had been one of gradual decline and diminished expectations. Now, suddenly, their small town was being featured in art magazines, education journals, and tourism guides. Delegations from other rural communities were visiting to study how Millfield had leveraged an unexpected cultural resource to revitalize itself. Graduate students in museum studies and rural development were writing dissertations about the Millfield model of community-based cultural preservation. The changes continued to unfold throughout the first year of operation. The museum exceeded all attendance projections, welcoming more than 50,000 visitors who brought millions of dollars in tourism revenue to the local economy. The educational programs attracted students from urban school districts who had never experienced rural life, creating cultural exchanges that benefited everyone involved. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was the establishment of the Edgar Whitmore Institute for Rural Cultural Development, a research and education center that worked with small communities across the country to identify and develop their own cultural resources. Harold and Martha had realized that while their discovery was unique, the principles behind their approach, identifying local assets, involving the community in decision-making, and focusing on long-term sustainability rather than short-term profit, could be applied anywhere. The Institute's first major project was a partnership with a declining coal mining town in West Virginia that had discovered a cache of Civil War-era artifacts during an environmental cleanup project. Instead of selling the artifacts to private collectors, the community worked with Institute experts to create their own heritage center that told the story of their region's complex history while providing economic opportunities for local residents. Similar projects followed in rural communities across America. A Kansas farming town that developed an agricultural heritage center around its collection of vintage machinery. A fishing village in Maine that created a maritime museum featuring traditional boat building techniques. A former logging town in Oregon that established a forest conservation education center. Each project was different, but they all shared the same underlying philosophy that Harold and Martha had embraced, that cultural resources belong to the communities that preserve them, and that sharing those resources with the wider world was the best way to ensure their long-term survival. As Harold approached his 80th birthday, he often reflected on the remarkable journey that had transformed him from a retired construction worker worried about paying his electric bill into an internationally recognized advocate for rural cultural development. The physical changes in their lives were obvious. They now lived comfortably, traveled regularly to conferences and exhibitions, and had resources they had never dreamed of possessing. But the deeper changes were more meaningful. They had discovered a sense of purpose that went far beyond their individual needs and desires. They had learned that true wealth wasn't measured by what you accumulated, but by what you contributed to the world around you. Martha, now 77, had become a sought-after speaker at conferences on museum education and community development. Her presentations always included the same basic message: that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they had the courage to think beyond their own circumstances and the wisdom to seek help from others who shared their values. The Edgar Whitmore Foundation had grown into one of the most respected cultural institutions in the country, with an endowment that ensured its work would continue long after Harold and Martha were gone. The scholarships they had established had already sent more than 100 young people to college, many of whom were now working in museums, schools, and cultural organizations around the world. But perhaps their greatest legacy was the proof they had provided that small communities could be partners in preserving and sharing humanity's greatest treasures. The assumption that important cultural resources belonged only in major metropolitan museums had been challenged by their success in bringing world-class art to a town of 3,000 people. On a warm spring evening, 5 years after their initial discovery, Harold and Martha sat on the front porch of their modest home, the same house where they had once worried about affording their medications, now comfortably renovated but still recognizably the same place where their remarkable journey had begun. They could see the lights of the Edgar Whitmore Cultural Campus glowing softly in the distance, where evening classes were in session and a community theater group was rehearsing for their spring production. Tour buses were parked in the visitor center lot, bringing tomorrow's guests to see the masterpieces that had once been hidden underground but were now shared with people from around the world. "Do you ever miss the quiet life we used to have?" Martha asked, watching a group of young people walk past on their way to the campus, their animated conversation about a Picasso drawing they had studied that day, carrying clearly in the evening air. Harold considered the question seriously. Their current lives were certainly more complex and demanding than their previous existence had been. They dealt with board meetings, exhibition planning, donor relations, and media attention that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I think about Tommy Rodriguez becoming a museum curator, and Sarah Chen getting excited about studying art history, and Mrs. Peterson having a job she loves, and I realize we didn't lose our quiet life. We traded it for something better." Martha nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. They had discovered that security wasn't about accumulating enough resources to protect yourself from the world. Real security came from being so deeply connected to your community and so clearly committed to something larger than yourself that you knew your life had meaning, regardless of what material circumstances you faced. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky above Millfield, Harold and Martha reflected on the words Edgar had written in his final journal entry, the words that had guided their decision-making from the very beginning. These works of art, these pieces of history, they were meant to be shared, not hidden away. They had taken those words seriously, and in doing so, they had transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of thousands of people who had been touched by Edgar's legacy. Students who had received scholarships, visitors who had experienced great art for the first time, community members who had found new purpose and pride in their hometown. All of them were part of the continuing story that had started with two elderly people stumbling upon a hidden treasure. But the real treasure, they had learned, wasn't the priceless artworks they had discovered underground. The real treasure was the understanding that generosity multiplies when it's shared, that communities can accomplish remarkable things when they work together toward common goals, and that ordinary people can leave extraordinary legacies when they have the courage to think beyond their own immediate needs. Anyone can transform not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others, when they choose to see inheritance not as personal wealth to be hoarded, but as responsibility to be shared with wisdom and generosity. As the last light faded from the western sky over Millfield, Harold and Martha Collins, the elderly couple who had inherited what they thought was worthless land, and discovered it contained treasures beyond imagination, knew that their greatest accomplishment wasn't finding Edgar's collection. It was proving that the most valuable inheritance of all is the courage to share what you've been given with those who need it most. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories of ordinary people making extraordinary discoveries. Click to keep exploring with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that generosity can change the world.